to me, and I think this organisation, we view the question of the militia as basically a fundamental, plank of our programme. And in that sense, we view it as no different to, say, the separation of church and state. We want to disestablish the Church of England. We want to take away all of its non-religious property. We view it the same way as we view the monarchy. Any idea, for example, of a socialist United Kingdom to us is an oxymoron, contradiction in terms. We view it in the same way as an 8-hour day. What Marx described in Capital, the reduction of hours as the Magna Carta of the working class. Same as we view a woman's right to access abortion or contraception, i.e., for example, in the United States. We view all of these as fundamental questions in our programme. And I do think it's just worthwhile here making the distinction between, for example, a faction and a party. At the back, I don't know if we got copies of it, but there's a little pamphlet called Problems of Communist Organisation. And in that, we explore the question of, a faction, which really is what we are, and how that's narrower, and how a faction would be justified, for example, in expelling people that you wouldn't necessarily call for the expulsion from if you were a party. In other words, a party, while it is based on fundamental programmatic questions, a faction is a narrower conception. Nonetheless, I would view all that I've listed out so far as fundamental to any party that we fight for. I cannot imagine a communist party that doesn't stand for all the particular planks that I've listed, and we could go on, but I'm not going to. So yes, from our point of view, a militia is a point of principle. It's not a tactical question. It's a question of, how should I put it, fundamental importance, because it will matter in terms of now. Crucially, it will matter in terms of the future. Now, in terms of the modern world, we can trace this idea back to Machiavelli. He's got a very bad reputation. Most people will have heard of the book, The Prince. Most people will have heard of Machiavelli, the schemer, how you statecraft, how you're cynical. But actually, at least Gramsci put forward a very interesting take, at least as far as I'm concerned, on the Prince, on Machiavelli. And he actually argued, I don't know whether it's true or not, doesn't really matter, but he certainly argued that, look, Machiavelli published The Prince openly. You could, I don't know, go to the bookshop, the library, or I don't know enough about Italian publishing in those times. Nonetheless, he said that what this was doing is actually making available the scheming, the cynicism of the princes of Italy or the leaders of states at the time, that these weren't honest people. They might have sat down there and prayed for guidance from Jesus bloody Christ, but in reality, they were out to enrich themselves, and they would stab literally rivals in the back. They were a pack of bastards, in other words. A similar argument, and this is a bit of a detour, I admit, a similar argument was put forward by Karl Kautsky on, what was it? Utopia by More. And you remember More was an advisor to, or prime minister, or whatever the particular post was, to Henry VIII, and he dedicated this book, Utopia, to Henry VIII. But this is at the time Henry VIII is doing enclosures, carrying out domestic terrorism, making homeless people, people without jobs illegal to the point of execution. I can remember going to a postmodern play. It was brilliant, which basically projected his daughter, good Queen Bess, as leading a terror state. I mean, I can't remember how many people were executed for the crime of begging and the crime of being homeless, but it ran into the tens of thousands, right? Anyway, the point would be, whatever the truth of the Prince and Machiavelli's other books, we know as a minister in Florence, as someone responsible for the running of the state in his native city of Florence, Machiavelli was responsible for getting rid of the mercenary system, where you just hired, professional soldiers and you engaged in more or less constant warfare with next door here and next door there, and shifting over to a militia system. And I argued, I think, on the first day that professional soldiers know their stuff. I wouldn't want to get into an argument with them. On the other hand, met by, a slightly larger mercenary army from next door, mercenary soldiers weren't particularly interested in dying. They were very interested in staying alive. They had no loyalty to their employers. And if they're faced by a bigger army, they tended to run, and that's exactly what happened in Florence. You put them to the field, you invade or you defend, I don't know what the particular circumstances were, and your glorious, highly paid mercenary army turns out to be useless. Now, Machiavelli said, well, we're basing our idea on ancient Rome. You can look back to ancient Rome, and it's certainly true. You had a citizen army to begin with. You can't maintain a citizen army when you've conquered an empire, because by definition, this army has to travel to Gaul or Germanica or Britannica or Egypt or Syria, and you're away 6 months, a year, 2 years. What happens to your harvest in that time? No one's there to plow, no one's there to gather. So they abandon, we know that they abandon the citizen militia. But the most important thing about Machiavelli isn't particularly the military effectiveness of it. It has its pluses, it has its minuses. What is significant is his book on war, his book advocating the militia, spreads throughout Europe. It becomes something that it's accepted by all advanced thinkers. It goes over the Atlantic with the English, Scots, and Irish colonists over to the 13 colonies in North America. And as I say, it becomes the common sense of all enlightened people. And you can trace it back, in terms of the right to bear arms, in terms of English law to the Magna Carta, although that doesn't include people like you and me. It's mainly concerned actually, with the nobility, their right to raise armies, their right to bear arms, but nonetheless, it's there in the Magna Carta. Same with the Glorious Revolution, the invasion by Dutch people, into Britain, taking over, clearing out the Catholic monarchy. The bourgeoisie invited the Dutch in, and that really represents the triumph, the final triumph of capitalism. From then onwards, capitalism in Britain is unchallenged. You have the Jacobite rebellion, but that's just not serious in terms of a threat. Okay, so in terms of Marxism, they basically take this idea and they go, well, of course we include a militia in our program. They didn't have an argument about it. They didn't really have a debate. It was just like, it was obvious that they would support a militia. So if you look at the Communist Manifesto, obviously the militia is there. If you look at the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, which is what they fight for in the 1848 revolution, it's there. Indeed, in the 1848 revolution, that's what they are establishing, people's militia. So when it comes to the first, I suppose what you would call the first Marxist party, although you have to put really heavy inverted commas around it, maybe I'll go into that. The 1875 merger between the Eisenachers and the Lassallians, that's obviously in there. Just thought I had a note on that one. Actually, the merger was actually between two semi-Marxists, Liebknecht and Bebel and their comrades, and the Eisenachers were actually also including people who were ex-Lassallians who split from, what's his name, Schweitzer, the guy that took over from Lassalle. They split on the basis of Lassalle and Schweitzer were Labour dictators, right? So you had this idea, you elect the General Secretary, and the General Secretary then is the equivalent of a monarch. And these people, which is relevant to the 1870 war with France, were quite prepared to do a deal with the Prussian state. So I'm just really, as I say, trying to put, in terms of the world's first Marxist party, a little bit into, in inverted commas and in context, which explains why, when it came to the merger between the Lassallians and the so-called Marxists, they so easily accepted, from Marx's point of view, embarrassing garbage, such as the people's state. And this was an object of attack by Bakunin in his book State and Statism, and was it Anarchism and Statism, whatever it was. Bakunin was attacking the Marxists and the Marx Party for this nonsense. Anyway, Marx found it deeply embarrassing, hence the critique of the go-through program that we all know. But the point I'm really establishing here is that either side, whether you were Lassallian or whether you were Marxist, of course they accepted the idea of a people's militia. And that applied to everyone in the Second International. I mean, we have this view, don't we, on the left, still in Britain. I'm sure it's true in Germany, the United States, Holland, Netherlands. You know, the Second International, we tend to say it with somewhat of a sneer, don't we? The Second International. I mean, we've had comments telling us all about the post box and how useless the Second International was and how easily it collapsed in 1914. Nevertheless, when it came to program, the Second International had no problem whatsoever. It was just someone adjusting the air conditioning, don't worry. No one had any problem with the people's militia question. So if you looked at the Austrian party, just look it up, it's online. There you are, the people's militia, the Italian party, the Spanish party, the French party. Indeed, in France, they drew up quite a sort of an elaborate program for the new army. That was the name of a book, and why the new army is militarily superior to the standing army. It's not very good at attacking. That's a good idea, isn't it? So that's one thing that recommended it to them, but it's pretty good at defense. It's not that it's going to be brilliant in terms of blocking an invasion initially, but what it does, it bogs the invading force down. It can attack from all sides. It's a bit like if you imagine someone wanting to invade Switzerland today. I wouldn't recommend it. every Swiss male between, I think, maybe 21 or something like, I don't know exactly, and 50 has to have an automatic rifle, and they locked up there over the fireplace or whatever the hell it is. But they all go in for military training. I think that sort of maybe now applies to women, in spite of the sort of social backwardness in many senses of Switzerland. But the point I'm making is that the militia, according to the theorists, is pretty bad if you want to invade foreign territory, but militarily superior in terms of an army of defense. Okay, so just for the sake of the few British people in the audience, that also, this assumption that we obviously want a people's militia, that also applies to the bloody Labour Party. You know, the Labour Party, even the Labour Party, when it was formed, its first manifesto had the demand for a people's militia. I don't know about the second or third or whatever, but that does tell you about this demand being the common sense of the Labour movement and the Second International. It was just so obvious that you put it in there. The Labour Party of Keir Hardie, a pacifist, Ramsay MacDonald, a Christian socialist, and all the rest of it, just put it in there and just said, well, yeah, of course we have that demand. Okay, so what I thought would be useful is actually trying to put this question of a militia in strategic context, because I've already spoken about the military plus and the military minus of the popular militia. But it is worthwhile putting it into a bigger picture, because we had the other day, we had Comrade Jim Cregan. I don't know if you're there today, Jim. I haven't got a list of who's online, but Jim was outlining what he called the Kautsky strategy. And he said, well, what it is, it's you stand in Parliament and you get more and more votes, and only when you get really loads of votes do you go for it. And you go for it, according to Kautsky, on the basis really of being prepared when the other side moves, right? So in other words, the strategy that Jim was outlining, and I accept that's an accurate description, the strategy of Kautsky is electoral success. You build the party up, you develop what was called in Germany at the time, both by our side and their side, a state within a state. So you're not just building votes. The German social democracy had cycle clubs, had its own pubs, had its own libraries, had its own trade unions, had its own sports associations, own women's organization, its own youth organization. You name it, every aspect of a working class life was touched upon by the party and organized by the party. So if you went to the pub, of course you'd go to a social democratic pub. The beer was better, the landlord was better, the prices were better, the company was better. So of course you did. And the same applied to many other aspects of working class life. So when you were at work, of course you were in a social democratic trade union, and that trade union was fighting to limit hours and fighting to improve your wages and conditions. You'd go along to the trade union meeting, discuss your tactics. So of course elections were important, but they were one aspect of it. Nevertheless, don't underestimate the importance of elections. Was that the uniquely Karl Kautsky strategy though? I argued at my last contribution yesterday, that's not, it is Kautsky, but that's not Kautsky. That is Marx and Engels, what Jim Cregan described as, you know, in a sneering way, how stupid and reformist and pacifistic and gradualistic. That's Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, Mike argued it a long time ago, and I don't know when he first started arguing, but But you know the little pamphlet that Lenin wrote, three component parts, or three sources and component parts of Marxism. I mean, everyone surely has read it. I think Lenin wrote it for an encyclopedia, some sort of Russian encyclopedia in 1913. Anyway, it's a lovely, lovely pamphlet. So he describes, you know, this is Karl Marx, this is when he's born, this is what he did, this is who he's influenced by, blah, 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 this is when he died, this is what he created. But he also talked about Marx's intellectual influences. And of course, there's Hegel. Famously, he didn't put Hegel on his head. No, he put Hegel on his feet. He took the idealism of Hegel, the dialectic of Hegel, and gave it a thoroughly materialist interpretation. What were the other sources? French socialism. So, you know, Saint-Simon, the left Jacobins, Babeuf, people like that. Utopian socialists, yes, but Marx thought highly of them. After all, in the Communist Manifesto, the chapter on them isn't utopian socialism, said with a sneer. It was critical utopian socialism. And basically, Marx said the founders of this school shouldn't be viewed but simply on the basis that they said, some of them did, that in the future everyone will wear blue, you know, everyone will be the same height, everyone, that sort of type stuff. No, he said their great achievement was to take existing society and savagely criticize it. And that was the huge achievement, and spread the idea of socialism in the working class. And that included people like Owen in Britain, right? So a critical but utopian socialism. These people the working class wasn't capable of doing anything else at the time. It existed, but it was atomized. It was not yet a class, certainly not a class for itself. What was the other source of Marxism? Famously, I think what good old Lenin called English economics, and he quoted Adam Smith. So nowadays, of course, I have to say, I mean, they all did it, didn't they? Everyone is English when they're Welsh and Scottish. So, of course, Adam Smith was Scottish, not English, Vladimir. But yes, Ricardo, Adam Smith, and their economics. And of course, we all know Capital. What's the subtitle of Capital? A critique of political economy. And that didn't mean you threw overboard and dismissed Ricardo and Smith and other such thinkers. Actually, what you did is systematically develop their insights and actually take their theory of the labor theory of value, and you thoroughly develop it. And of course, what you do if you do that is you come to the conclusion, not that the source of all wealth is labor, but the source of all surplus value is labor. And yeah, capital, both banking capital and industrial capital, live off the surplus labor produced by workers. But, argues Mike McNair and me now, because once he said it, I don't know whether he originated the idea or whether he read it somewhere else. But Mike has made a very good point, I think, and this is very important to us, I think, in these circumstances. There was actually a fourth source and component part of Marxism, and that is, I was about to say English Chartism, but we'll stick with British Chartism because of the uprising in South Wales, movement in Scotland, and the industrial belt up in Dundee, etc. But yes, British Chartism, because this was the world's first working class party, of where the working class formed itself into a party. But what demand did they form themselves into a class around? Well, there were many demands, But what was the central demand? Universal male suffrage. And Tony Cliff says in his stupid book on the Labour Party that this was a moderate demand, and that Marx and Marxists fight for moderate demands, but in a militant way. That's just plain stupid. This was a revolutionary demand. The Chartists, right, were a mass working class party, and clearly, if you have one man, sorry about the women, one vote, the Chartists will be elected. It's interesting, actually, in that particular context, when they established the International Working Man's Association, First International, someone, I don't know who it was, came up to Charlie and said, what about women? Are women allowed to join? He just went, of course women are allowed to join the International Working Man's Association. And I don't know enough about Chartism that if you actually raised with them, what about women, what the reaction would be. Obviously, from our point of view, it's one person, one vote. As I understand it, from, how should I put it, left Scottish nationalists, I have read that in Scotland, the Chartists, which is why I think it was good to call it British Chartism, they actually did raise the demand, one person, one vote. I don't know if there was an argument down here in England. Either way, the main point I'm trying to say is that Marxism took Chartism as one of its basic founding ideas. I'd say a pretty fundamental one, the organization of the workers into a party which fights for universal suffrage. And Marx argued throughout his life, I'll just take one particular phrase of his, that this means of deception can be turned into its opposite. It can be turned into a weapon on our side, and one of the sharpest at that. And I think what he would be thinking about at the time would be people like Louis Bonaparte. He used the referendum as a means of obscuring reality, as a means of kidding people, as a means of, on the one side, conceding to the masses, but in reality, actually establishing a dictatorship. Something that Bismarck also did in Germany. So Marx said, okay, they are allowing people to vote, true, but we need to fight for the right to vote, but we then need to be getting people to vote for something that's worthwhile voting for, i.e. a mass workers' party, what was then called social democracy, what is now called communism or Marxism. We don't mind, do we? But the whole point would be this, that this electoral strategy, one person, one vote, building our strength in Parliament, but also building our strength outside Parliament, building a state within a state, goes hand in hand with the fight for a people's militia. And if you want to see a quite interesting, how should I put it, plan in that for that outcome, I think I've got the date right, but I could easily be wrong. I should have really looked it up, but if anyone tells me I'm wrong, shout out, please. It's Engels's pamphlet, Can Europe Disarm? Does anyone know the date? I think it's 1892. But as I said, I could be wrong. Some bright sparks will be looking it up now and will tell me it's 1891, and I'm all embarrassed and God, I can. Anyway, the point would be in that Engels puts forward in the name of a military expert, and as I'd argued, he certainly was a military expert. He put forward the plan that social democracy, not only in Germany, but other countries should fight for. And this is for a people's militia. And what it got him into quite a lot of trouble, because the social democracy in Germany had just emerged in recent terms from illegality, was starting to gain success in Reichstag elections. And there's this old man in London, that's what they used to call him, the old man, used to be the old men in London, but Marx had died. So the old man in London's produced this pamphlet. We asked him to, but it's a bit embarrassing because what he's calling for, yes, is a people's militia. We have no problem with that. It's in our program. I don't know what they stood for in terms of every general election. I presume it was there. I'm just guessing. Someone like Ben could put me right on that. But what it did, it said, well, the great thing about a people's militia wasn't just what I've outlined. It's not very good in terms of attacking, pretty good when it comes to defense. What Engels said is, well, imagine our tough proletarian lads being recruited to the popular militia. What's going to happen to the sergeants? We're talking about the Prussian army, which is the core of the German army. Brutal, brutal discipline. I mean, to the point where, this is what Engels describes, there are many instances of what we now call in the modern world fragging. Everyone know what fragging is? Jim?
Well, it's usually attacking your Muslim with maybe a grenade, maybe something short.
Exactly. Gabby tells me that it originated, in terms of it's a grenade, so boom, but it became any killing of your own officers. And of course, this became very, the way I presume the word was developed, came from Vietnam. It might have been earlier. Either way, when I, was growing up, becoming political, I heard all about fragging. And the death rate in the American army for officers wasn't because, as in the old days, they would go to battle, with what's it called, a swagger stick or whatever the hell it was, and a special cap with loads of, gold braid, and the other side would go, oh, there's an officer, bang. It wasn't that. It's their own bloody side in Vietnam that would take a pot shot at them. And that is what happened in the Prussian army. That's so brutal were the officers, so brutal were the sergeants, their own side took vengeance on them by going, whoops, that was an accident, wasn't it? So what Engels said is you have a people's militia, yes, under the existing system, under the existing emperor there in Berlin. But okay, there's our proletarian lads, they join up the army. Are they going to take this brutal discipline? Short-term service in the militia, right? And the idea that Engels put forward in his pamphlet is, well, okay, they're not going to take this discipline, but crucially, imagine a situation of where social democracy either got a majority in the lower house, not the upper house, in the lower house, or is expected to get a majority, and the other side launch a coup, right? This is the Engels plan. Under those circumstances, what you do is you encourage mutiny, right? And you would expect mutiny. Here's an army of the people are armed. So it's not just people who are serving their year or half year military service, the people are armed. What you do is call upon the people to resist a coup by who? Presumably by the officer class or whoever it is. Under those circumstances, Engels argued in his pamphlet, that's the revolution. That is the revolution. So yes, when the pamphlet was produced, it caused some in the party some discomfort because they just, as I said, emerged from illegality. And there was the old man in London advocating a new military system that will be perfect from a Marxist point of view to ferment mutiny. So couldn't you put that a different way, Fred? Couldn't you rephrase that? Couldn't you just take it out, etc.? But that is the Marxist strategy, not Karl Kautsky. Well, it was Karl Kautsky, but if you want to call that Kautskyism, actually what you're talking about is Marxism, Engels Marx. That is the strategy. Okay, what sort of time are we? Going all right, yeah, going all right. Okay, so let's think about Russia. The army, it's a standing army. Revolution happens, February. Soldiers refuse to fire. mutiny. Provisional government was put in. Provisional government sort of comes from the remnants originally of the suspended Duma, but very quickly takes on a red coloration with Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries joining that government and ending up in the form of Kerensky. He was some sort of populist socialist. Anyway, either way, you end up with a supposedly red government that is committed to carrying on the secret war aims of Tsarism. I think Lars later will talk about agreementism and all the rest of it, but these war aims, of course, from Russia's point of view, was taking over Constantinople, Istanbul, stuff like that. People suspected stuff like that, but it was Trotsky when he became foreign minister, wasn't it? That was responsible for presiding over the publication of all these secret treaties and exposing the war aims, not only of Russian Tsarism, but French imperialism and British imperialism. So while Russia would get Constantinople, for example, the Brits and the French got what they got, didn't they? Syria, what is now called Syria, what is now called Iraq, and all you need to do is just look at a map, and then you've got these straight lines and this, and that's a pipeline. Had nothing to do with the people that lived on the ground and what accent they talk, spoke in, or some river going down like that. This was literally French and British imperialism carving up the Middle East as if you would carve up a piece of cake. Nice, neat lines. I'll have that bit. You can have that bit. You have Lebanon. I'll have whatever the hell, Jordan, Palestine, whatever. Carve it. I'll have that bit of oil. You have that bit of oil. So anyway, my real point is that if you look at 1917, of course, the revolution is carried out. Trotsky's in command. Lenin is out there in some horrible place in Finland, sitting there in a hut and apparently getting bitten to hell by these gnats and all those. He didn't enjoy himself. It must have been hell. But meanwhile, back in Petrograd, back in Moscow, Trotsky is wasn't he head of the Soviet military committee, revolutionary military committee. He gave the orders to change the guards. And so there you are, there's the Winter Palace, provisional government. Right, you lot, you're off guard, you lot, you're on guard, except who's on guard now? Under the command of Trotsky, under the discipline of the Revolutionary Committee of the Soviet, and of course, Red Guards. Who are the Red Guards? They were a factory-based militia. You got paid by the boss. It's a substitute for the police, because one of the first things that happens in February is the police run away or are hunted down. And they're not only disarmed, I hasten to add, they are treated with the brutality often that they richly deserved. So the police disappear, and the workers, in order to keep law and order, establish their own militia. And what's worthwhile noting, because some comrades on the left, I've heard them say, well, no, we don't want a people's militia. That's soft, isn't it? That's sort of, no, what we want is a workers' militia. Well, just look at Lenin writing in 1917. What he says is that the Red Guards, the workers' militia, are a step towards the people's militia that we want to establish. And again, just to carry on the story a bit, we know that the Bolsheviks are forced to violate their own program. Given the Civil War, they have to establish a standing army. I think comrades will know all about the commissars, how you had Tsarist officers, but next to them signing their orders, you had a communist saying yes or no, or whatever, to be in political command. As the Civil War is on the verge of being completed, Trotsky, I think, goes to the Central Committee and says, as now head of the Red Army, Minister or Commissar for Defence, or is it Commissar of War? I suspect in those days it will be Commissar for War. Defence came in later. I don't know when that happened. You know, we don't make war anymore, do we? We only defend ourselves. Anyway, my main point is he goes to the Central Committee and says, well, yeah, the Red Army has been great, hasn't it? You know, we won. We recruited peasant soldiers. We had communist officials, czarist officers, but we've won now. So can we please disband the Red Army and go back to our program? And I think the comrades went, well, yeah, Leon, but not yet. And we, of course, know what happened. That idea was left behind, and we had, I suppose, a standing army with the sort of discipline, as I understand it, that was Prussian. You know, the Soviet army or the modern Russian army, horrendous mistreatment of rank and file troops. Either way, I'm just trying to illustrate the idea of a militia was still something that they were committed to, even though they'd violated their own program. They were well aware that they'd violated their own program. And the idea would have been, I think, in all their heads, to go back to the program and put in a system of militia. I know in the Soviet Union you had the People's Militia, but it was a police force. I'm talking about a real People's Militia that I've described already. Okay, you'll be glad now that I'm getting in the last quarter an hour, 10 minutes to the subject on the paper, because I've done the militia. Now I'm doing, why the hell do they hate it? Well, they do, don't they? Well, I mean, I'll just give you a couple of examples. We were in this thing called the Socialist Alliance, and it consisted of 6 principal organizations. So there were 6 main organizations, and then it had individual membership. That included the British Socialist Workers' Party. It included, I don't know what the hell they called themselves then, Resisting Socialism, it's what our name, the Socialist Resistance. I don't know what the hell, they have so many different names. But the official Fourth International, it consisted of the Alliance for, we've got to say this with a sneer, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, the Alliance for Atlanticism, or anyway, you get the point, social chauvinists. It also consisted of SPEW, the organization which calls itself, who on earth called themselves that, by the way? Socialist Party in England and Wales. I mean, you know, you just look at the, you know, an anecdote. International companies, when they market a car or any product, basically do world research, right, to make sure that in South Korea, this word doesn't mean poo. I mean, I'm not joking. I know that from my old hometown, Kodak, right? Kodak, the camera company, right, actually did international research to make sure that the word Kodak, which had nothing to do with the company that owned it in that sense. Who was the name? Eastman, wasn't it? Eastman was the guy that established it. But they did research to make sure that in every country that they were going to go, Kodak didn't mean something embarrassing. I'll take a Kodak. What? You know, guffaws of laughter. But yeah, anyway, it consisted of these organizations. So SPEW was one of them. Another organization that was a principal organization was Workers' Power. And then there was us. And our approach to these unity projects is we don't mind being in a unity project. We think it was good to bring together these 6 organizations. We put forward the idea of merging into a party. We agitated for a paper, a Socialist Alliance paper. I remember one of the early meetings, I put forward the idea of, well, we should stand in elections. And I suggested 30 candidates. Why 30? Because at least then, I don't know what the situation is now, you get a TV broadcast, right? Lindsay German said, oh no, that's far too ambitious. And then we basically, as a leadership, we just said to the comrades out there in membership land, well, you do your own thing. I think we ended up with over 100 candidates, which had nothing to do with us saying there should be 100. It's just that, and people raised their own money, you know, so it shows you what even a modest step forward can do. Anyway, my main point is on this subject, we put forward in terms of what election manifesto we should stand on, what platform the Socialist Alliance should build on. Amongst the many demands that we put forward, things like abolish the monarchy, abolish the House of Lords, PR, Ireland united, self-determination for Scotland, stuff like that. And amongst the, from our point of view, standard demands, yes, a popular militia. We can't have that. That's mad, right? Mad, isn't it? It's completely crazy. So yeah, that didn't get in there. And when you raise it, you know, you have a conference and you say, well, we actually think we should vote for a popular militia. You know, there would be our hands that go up for it. Workers' power, has to be said. They put their hands up, and then there will be a sea of people giggling and, you know, oh, that's crazy of these people. We really have landed with the loonies, haven't we, sort of type idea. You get some strange people on the left, don't you? Okay, so there's them lot who clearly are, you know, people who talk about the October Revolution, talk about the Paris Commune, which also established, of course, a people's militia, right? Talk about Marxism and all the rest of it, but in reality are committed to trade union type politics within the existing constitution. And what their version of politics is you encourage workers to go on strike. One strike leads to 2 strikes, 2 strikes leads to 10, 10 strikes lead to 100, 100 strikes lead to the general strike. Capitalism collapses and we walk in. Do you have any? No, the soldiers, I presume, meanwhile go on strike. The Navy goes on strike. The Air Force goes on strike. The civil service, all in them. To me, that this is Bakunin. This is anarchism, and the anarchism that Friedrich Engels mocked in 1873, and Engels himself mocked also, not in a hopefully patronizing way, although perhaps, when it came to the Chartists and them voting for the general strike, the holy month they called it, in 1839, that was tested out in 1842 because of the bosses. They thought you go on strike for a month, everything comes to a halt and the other side surrenders. Either way, that is the result of the so-called transitional method. It's Marxism, but in name only. This owes a lot more to anarchism. And I understand why, if you've got the so-called transitional method guiding you, you would reject the people's militia. Why would you reject it? Because the so-called, and this has nothing to do with 1938 and Trotsky and his program, which we can deal with separately. What the so-called transitional method does, it says what we've got to do is take existing consciousness as our starting point. So if you go out there, go to the tube station, go to the bus stop, go to the pub, go to the restaurant, go around people. So what do you think of the idea of a people's militia? I mean, would 1 in 100 say that's a good idea, or would it be 1 in 1,000? If you went, you know, well, I don't know what the percentage would be. All I would say is it would be incredibly small, and I suspect that's true also with other planks of our program. But that's not the point, is it? The point of a Marxist party is not to start with existing consciousness. It's to start with what is necessary. What is necessary to form the workers into a party, and what is necessary for that party to come to power. And you build the party around that program. You don't build the party around existing consciousness, because if you did, as with the SWP, and I'll finish with this one, you end up as monarchists, right? And I'm not joking, and I'll illustrate in terms of my closing couple of minutes, the so-called transitional method with this particular anecdote. There we are in this abomination of an organization called Respect. There's George Galloway. Was he an MP at the time? I can't remember. I don't think so. But he was an ex-Labour MP who could win elections and did win elections as an anti-Blair candidate. But he was someone who could appeal not only to left-wing voters, but also Muslim voters. And what we had in Respect is not only George Galloway, we also had an organization, what was it, the Muslim Association of Britain, MAB. This is the British branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So the same as Hamas, the same as Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, etc. So we also had, resisting socialism, SWP. This is John Rees's, the ex-leader of the SWP. This is his project. It's a popular front. It's a classic popular front. And so what we had, we because we had the ability to move motions and amendments and all the rest of it, one of our motions was we should abolish the monarchy. I mean, we also, just by the way, also put forward in terms of this conference, the SWP's, socialist workers, what we stand for column. We actually put forward elements of that and they voted it down. So we said we should fight for socialism in the SWP's form. They put their hands up. We stand for what we stand for column, except we don't. Anyway, we put forward the idea, not of the people's militia, but we put forward the idea of abolishing the monarchy. Monarchy, anti-democratic, not a good idea, socialist principle to have a republic. And the SWP put up a speaker and they said, yeah, but we wouldn't get the votes of monarchists, would we, if we do that? And I finish on that basis. So to me, the transitional method, yes, of course, you start with existing consciousness, and therefore you view the militia as a joke, something embarrassing, far too advanced for the present situation. Yes, that's certainly true. But look at the history of Marxism, look at the history of the demand for the militia, how it goes all the way back to Machiavelli, how every radical, how every Democrat has stood for that, how the social democracy stood for it, how the Labour Party stood for it. And now we have an existing left in Britain and in other countries rejecting that demand. And as I understand it, here's me stepping in for the Netherlander comrades. In the Netherlands, the Socialist Party, some sort of ex-Maoist, they actually accused comrades who put forward the idea of a militia as advocating terrorism. And I think that tells you something about the problem we have with the existing left, not only in Britain, but globally. Let's get back to classical Marxism.